All right, I've got 7, so I'm not sure if you guys all are on the same clock as I am, but we're going to get started. So hi everyone, my name's Skylar Frank. I work for the London Environmental Network and I am your host and your moderator tonight. So we're going to get started if you'd like to settle on in. And thank you for joining us at the Green and Just Recovery Town Hall. We're really glad to have you all here and making time for this discussion tonight. And to all our presenters and speakers as well who are here with us and spending their evening talking about what we can imagine our future to look like. There's been a lot of discussion online. I'm sure people are following it, probably around the dinner table and the media, regarding what our recovery plans should look like post-COVID. And our collective organizations that you can see on the screen, we really want to localize some of those chats and have invited some politicians and some speakers to answer those questions and share their ideas about what a green and a just recovery would look like for London and what it would look like to them. So during our town hall and throughout the recovery process, it's vital for us to recognize that our current and our previous societal structures are unequal, they're unjust, they have to be rebuilt and they have to be built better. They need to serve more people and they need to improve the lives of everyone in society. And we need to continue the work that we're doing on reconciliation. So tonight we are virtually gathered on the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Lenape peoples, with our current Indigenous neighbors downstream Deshkun-Zibi, also known as the Thames River, which are the Chippewa of the Thames First Nation, Oneida Nation of the Thames, and Munsee Delaware Nations. And for any recovery plan that is green, that's inclusive, that's just, it has to uphold Indigenous rights and act in solidarity with Black, Indigenous, and otherwise marginalized folks in our society, and it has to be actively anti-racist. So I encourage all the attendees tonight to seek out some actions where they can support and stand in solidarity with these communities. So this event tonight has been organized by a great group of local organizations, which include For Our Kids, the London Environmental Network, Climate Action London, Chippewa of the Thames First Nation, the Treaties, Lands and Environment Department, the Urban League of London at LOSA, Poverty Research Centre at King's, the Council of Canadians, Women in Politics, and the Middlesex London Food Policy Council. And so the process for our town hall tonight is we're going to start with 3 short presentations by local advocates on what a green and a just recovery would look like to them. So I'll introduce them a little bit later, but we'll have Malvin Wright, Genevieve, and Joel Abrams, and they'll be speaking a bit about to them what they would like to see post-COVID. We're going to be asking questions after that to the local politicians to find out, what they see as really important parts of the recovery process. Not all of the questions will be answered by all politicians just for the sake of time. So we're trying to direct them to the most appropriate jurisdictional level. And the questions will be asked by the representative from the organization who submitted them, unless they're unable to attend, and then I will fill in. The politicians will have about 4 minutes to answer their questions, so that just so we can keep the session moving along and hearing from lots of people. And around 8:15, we're going to be pulling questions from the chat box. So please put in questions you have throughout the session. We're going to kind of be looking through them and picking a couple themes, and any questions we don't get to answer tonight, we would like to make sure that you add them to the chat box so we can keep them for another event and we can recycle those questions. So we know that a lot of people have been thinking about these things and have lots to want to learn about. Just make sure that anything you're putting into the chat box is respectful. We're going to be monitoring it, and we're not afraid to remove people if they're being disrespectful and not treating others kindly. So please keep that in mind if you're adding stuff to the chat box. We'll also be using the poll feature in Zoom to get your feedback and some ideas. And you've noticed probably by now that your screens and your mics are turned off, and that's just to keep the flow of discussion going without any interruptions. But again, please feel free to add your questions to the chat box. Finally, we are recording, so we'll be able to post this video later on, and you can share it with people who missed out being here in person. All right, so we also believe that it's essential to seek out and encourage viewpoints that challenge our prevailing norms of the dominant culture in matters of race, gender, class, and environmental protection. So that's why we reorganized this event to this date to include more voices on those topics. And so I'm super glad to be able to introduce some of these voices tonight who have joined us. So first off, for one of our presentations will be Malvin Wright, and he will be talking about what he sees for a green and just recovery for London. Malvin is a community development practitioner with over 20 years of experience leading global health and community development projects, programs and campaigns in over 4 countries globally, and also Nunavut and Ontario. He has also led programs in HIV/AIDS prevention and education, Millennium Development Goals, microcredit, malnutrition, and public health through an empowerment and community-led approach. He's passionate about finding creative solutions that are grounded in equity, justice, and solidarity. He also sits locally on the board of directors with Pillar Nonprofit Network and is a founding member of Black London Network, while he also participates and lends his experience to other community development and social justice projects. Melvin is driven by a desire to do meaningful work that benefits communities, and he's also an aspiring leader, entrepreneur, and believes that it's important to be willing to learn and challenge the language around race, identity, place, and space by creating new tools, new languages, and new processes. Melvin is a loving and doting father of 4, and I can attest I have seen some of his kids on Zoom and they're adorable. He's also an entrepreneur. He loves to spend time with his wife and children, and he also enjoys baking and running. So Melvin, I'm going to turn it over to you to tell us what you see for a green and a just recovery from your perspective. And I think you can unmute.
Yes. Okay. Yes. Thank you. Thanks, Skylar. I appreciate it. I think for me, I think first of all, I'm very grateful for this opportunity to be here and to participate, to speak and to share thoughts and ideas, especially around what's next. There was a bit of I was really thinking about how to approach this and what that angle would be. And since I have only 5 minutes, I guess I better get going. So I think for me, I think what's first off the bat, I think what COVID-19 is showing us is nothing new. In a very curious and precise manner, COVID-19 is amplifying a lot of the things that we already knew. People of color, Black people, my Indigenous brothers and sisters have always known that the health system was never created to serve our needs, address our issues, and demonstrate the empathy, understanding, and justice and equity needed for us to heal and become whole by our own hands or by our own means and within our own system. So the social determinants of health we already know in terms of social and economic factors like income, race, discrimination, access to quality food, country food, culturally specific foods, healthcare, and education. All these things impact just in terms of a person's health, and literally they affect in terms of how long we live and the quality of that life. And I think one of the things that I've arrived on is that I think when we have this discussion, it's usually from a green or from an environmental lens, and from a planning lens at the same time. And I think it needs to be stated that environmentalists, planners really need to understand that without racial justice, there is no environmental justice. Okay, and I think if we let that sit and let that marinate for just a little while, and I think the same thing goes that there's no climate justice, there's no economic justice, there's no justice at all until we address and look at those systems of anti-Black racism and the racism and the systemic systems that exist, and we address those issues, then we cannot move on and fix or tweak or break down and create anything new. Anti-Black racism is everywhere. I think that is also another point that needs to be spoken out loud and needs to be said. Discrimination against women is a global problem. Discrimination against Indigenous people is also prevalent globally at the same time. And what is interesting is we are at a point of query and a point of intersection and a point of reflection as a society. We really need to look within, examine the existing systems, and see what we need to do to move forward and to make those systemic changes. I think what is interesting is that at some point, that if we are to really transform to make big changes, I think one of the things that really has to take place is that we need to look at have that boldness for that intersection, but also we need to challenge those existing narratives that we hold on to. what I call those narratives which comfort us at night, the narratives that are caught up and interwoven in our flags, in our anthems, and in our notion of nation building as a whole. You know, I think it's at some point where we often speak about building back better post COVID. But I think for many of us, we are not interested in building anything back. I think it's about how can we create something new, and do we have the notion, and are we brave enough as a society to actually build back something new? Listen, cities are the centers of culture and commerce, and we need to have a better way of highlighting those parts and creating cities that are much more just, much more equitable for everyone who involved. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Melvin. That was well said, well put. I agree. There's no justice without changing the systemic issues that we have within our systems, and that should be a collaborative effort. So I appreciate you sharing that with us. Next, we have Genevieve Langille. I'm saying it in a French way. I'm sorry, Genevieve. Who is a 17-year-old climate activist who just finished grade 12 at London Central Secondary School. She's previously co-organized protests for climate action in London, some of which have had over 2,000 attendees. I feel like the one I went to, Genevieve, had 4,000, so I'm gonna change that. But she's also been featured in the London Free Press, on CBC Radio, on CTV News, and a variety of other news networks. She's mainly interested in minimizing the impact of climate change that it will have on the Global South and international Indigenous populations. So we'd love to hear your perspective.
Thank you. Am I unmuted now, I think? Yeah, okay.
You're good.
Okay, thank you, Skylar. Okay, so I'm gonna just start in right away. So it is vital that we recover from this pandemic without simply returning to our former systems. That's obvious, because we know those systems are unsustainable for the next 7 generations and beyond. We know that climate change is going to cause more natural disasters, resource wars, refugee crises, and epidemics like this. This demonstrates the urgency of action on it while we can, because climate change is completely solvable if we act now. There are some things I'm going to assume you already know are vital, like funding the planting of trees in London, banning single-use plastics from businesses in our city, and implementing electric car charging stations. Other initiatives that I think would be worthwhile include beginning to give land back to the First Nations communities who rightly own it, which could be initiated by giving a segment of the Thames River in London back, similar to how the city of Vancouver and other major cities have done. Also, directing pandemic relief efforts to the Munsee Delaware Nation, Oneida of the Thames, and Chippewa of the Thames should be a priority. Furthermore, I believe some funding should go to starting up public-owned co-ops like tool and material libraries to reduce consumerism and strengthen our London communities. And finally, I believe funding should go to creating 2 separate funds to help BIPOC-owned businesses and green businesses flourish in the wake of this pandemic. We need to think of ideas that will restabilize the economy, but mainly help people and do so without contributing to climate change. A model of government decision-making that uses these parameters to guide policy is needed, and I recommend looking into the donut community model, which is currently being implemented in Amsterdam and is being considered by the EU. The main idea I'm going to propose fits within this model exceptionally well and meets both the just and green components of a just and green recovery. Currently, Yemen has the largest humanitarian crisis in the world, with upwards of 24 million people needing assistance and numerous children in need and starving. In the Yemen crisis, most civilian deaths have been caused by Saudi-led coalition airstrikes. What is the connection to London? Near the London airport sits General Dynamics Land Systems, a plant that manufactures light armored vehicles. These light armored vehicles go to Saudi Arabia as part of a revised $14 billion deal the Canadian federal government has. There's conclusive proof that these light armored vehicles manufactured here in our city are being used by Saudi Arabia in Yemen. What can we do about this? We cannot simply close the General Dynamics site. That would sacrifice thousands of jobs of Londoners, and as a city, we simply do not have the capacity to do that. What I am proposing does not lose jobs, it creates them, as well as huge economic profit for our city. What I am proposing is a conversion of the General Dynamics plant that makes light armored vehicles into a light rail or trackless tram construction plant. This would create jobs that have the capacity to be unionized and employ Londoners with living wages. Additionally, London is perfectly situated to be a hub for research and technology on transportation. We have the capacity of the universities of Western and Waterloo for both physics and engineering research, both of which would be motivated to participate in this. An interurban light rail system would get Canadians from Toronto to Halifax or Vancouver in comfort and with reduced emissions. It would connect Canadian cities, increasing tourism and bringing success to other communities while doing so sustainably and reducing emissions. with no margin for error, as this would be worth the investment threefold. It must be done in accordance with UNDRIP and would need to be done within the standard of free, prior, and informed consent with First Nations and Métis communities across Canada, and partnerships with communities to connect them to major cities whilst avoiding trespassing onto their land at all costs. Interurban light rail has been done before, most notably in Germany, and it is a relatively cheap, cost-effective option, and implementing it is one of the greatest stepping stones on the path to solving climate change. Even if the United States, Canada, and other industrialized countries decarbonize, it will not matter unless the rest of the world does too. After this plant constructs a light rail system webbing through Canada, it would have the expertise and capacity to continue producing light rail on a major scale. It could then export light rail to industrializing nations who will be looking for a cheap transportation method for their citizens as their country industrializes. Canada would hugely profit, but also be making a huge headway in the fight to stop climate change. And so how can you help this happen? Why did I even bring it up or put this all together? I'm in fact a teenage climate activist. You're used to me generally protesting, not proposing ideas. Well, here's the part you play. As political representatives, councillors, MPs, you have a connection to government. If this idea can be conceptualized and its ins and outs can be assured to work, then it can be brought through the levels of government and eventually land on Justin Trudeau's desk, where he will be met with an idea that he cannot turn down. It is a proposal that would stop our city's involvement in an international crisis, put Canada on track to ending its emissions, and make London into a world-renowned city for light rail innovation. It is my idea of a green and just recovery, and it is quite a bold initiative, but it is just a small idea without your help. Please contact me if you have further questions. Thank you, Skylar.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Genevieve. That was lovely. I can feel your passion coming through the computer, and I also love how specific your ideas are for solutions.
Thank you.
I think that's definitely, we need specific ideas, we need solutions in order to create these new systems because they're new. So thank you for sharing all of those ideas. I hope that they get in touch with you. Next up for our presentations, we have Grand Chief Joel Abram, and he's our final presenter for this beginning segment. Joel hails from Oneida Nation of the Thames Settlement and is a member of the Wolf Clan, and his Oneida name is Tawa Slake, which translates to axe with two blades. Joel has served for 12 years on the elected chief and council in Oneida, 6 as a councillor and 6 as a chief, and he has had a role in initiating the institution of a Gladue court in the city of London, the third version of that type of court in Ontario. He's also played a critical role in the successful establishment of a 64-bed long-term care facility in Oneida, and Joel has been involved in the Oneida community radio station, 89.5 The Eagle, in various roles including DJ, fundraiser, and technician for the past 17 years. In his free time, Joel enjoys playing competitive chess, spending time with his family, and getting out his guitar to play the occasional gig with his brother. So Joel, please share your ideas of what you'd like to see.
Okay, thank you. Sa gulis sa gwegi, dawas lagi ni yung get so tayo ni getalodo. Onya da aga ni wag hon joda klet onya da aga hon go ho ni dignige. Just did a quick greeting in my language, Oneida language, and I just said, well, I always say my GST name is Joel Abram for purposes of taxation. My Oneida name is Dewazluk. It was the way you pronounce that, but thank you for that. And again, from the Wolf Clan Oneida, which is where I currently reside as well. So I'd like to thank everyone for inviting me to this gathering as well. I think it's pretty interesting. And I think maybe the first thing that I'll say is that I think it's important to recognize, about, if you're talking about just and a green recovery, I think that's right down Indigenous people's alley and kind of where we want to see society evolve in general. Not only, there's Iroquois, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi, Delaware. There's a lot of different nations here in southern and southwestern Ontario and the London region. And there's a lot of different overlapping treaties and jurisdictions and responsibilities. But one in particular that I like to talk about is dates back to 1701. It's called a Dish with One Spoon Treaty. And I wish I'd brought out the wampum belt with me to show you, but basically the symbolism is that we're supposed to treat this whole area, and it's an agreement dating back between all the nations in this area. And it basically, the area is supposed to symbolically be a bowl or a dish, and there's only one spoon. There's no knives, no sharp edges. And it's basically an agreement for us all to share the resources within this area. But it's not just an obligation with each other. It's also sort of an obligation with the environment itself. because in order to ensure that the environment's going to be there for everyone to benefit from, whether it's game or plants or whatever kind of resources are in that territory, it's also an obligation to manage those properly so that they're there for future generations. Because everything, our worldview is that everything has a right to be there as it was, as it is. For instance, water, we believe that water has a spirit, and, everything has been put there for a reason. At the beginning of most of our meetings that we formally have, we have opening prayers, and it's called and some people do this every day, and you really probably should. It's called a Thanksgiving address. One thing my grandfather always said is, in order to be happy, you have to be thankful for what you have, even if you have very little. And so that's something that we do, is we thank, the people, we thank everything, from the insects to the medicines, to the grasses, to the trees, and then we move on all up to the birds in the sky and everything that's in creation that we give thanks for, and just to remind us of our place in it. And I think that sometimes that's what we forget, is we think we're just at the top of the food chain and everything else is disposable. But we can't remember that we're part of that cycle. And I think that's important going forward, is that we all remember that, is that we're just one small link in this chain, and we have a responsibility to help to maintain our balance within that. And that's something that's hard to do sometimes. With regards to jurisdiction, and I think that's something that, we could all be sharing in, and be respectful of each other. There's another treaty I'd like to talk about briefly, which is called the Two-Row Wampum, or the Gaswanta, we call that. And it was an original, first treaty ever made in North America, was between the Iroquois and the Dutch. And it was basically a white background with 2 purple rows on it. And there was 3 white rows of wampum shells in between. And the rows represented the European culture, people, laws, everything in their vessel, and the Iroquois people, laws, culture, and everything in their vessel. And they're traveling side by side down the river of life together. And in between, the 3 rows would represent peace, respect, and friendship. And that one vessel would not guide the other. Unfortunately, that's not the way things have gone. I think, and a lot with regards to Indigenous peoples especially, there's a doctrine that Canada has been following, and all governments are sort of based their authoritarianism or jurisdiction over Canada based on this. It's called the Doctrine of Discovery, and that's based on an earlier papal bull from around 1450 by Pope Nicholas IV called Terra Nullius. And what the effect of the Doctrine of Discovery, it basically said that if a European came across any empty lands, or lands that didn't have any Christians in it, that land could be treated as empty, as those people, if they weren't Christians, weren't really human. So you could then treat the lands as though they were empty, and then claim the lands and do what you will with those inhabitants, whether you wanted to convert them to Christianity or whether or not you wanted to eliminate them or what have you. So that's led to a lot of policies, from residential schools to 60 Scoop. It's led to other issues, the loss of lands, murdered missing Indigenous women and girls. So there's a whole host of things, stemming from that doctrine that Indigenous peoples have been subject to. For instance, we know that South Africa has used Canada's model of how they treated Indigenous people for apartheid. And that's a fact also that's known. So we have so apartheid was based on that. So, and that still exists. Those structural systems are still there. And I know that everyone here can say, that wasn't me, that was my ancestors, so don't blame me, kind of thing. But if the structures are still in place, then there is still a little bit of responsibility there to, take those structures apart. And
I'm just gonna have to ask you to just wrap up the last couple sentences. Sorry, I'm just keeping us up on time.
Okay, no problem. But there is a lot of opportunity for us to move together in a good way. But I think it's important for people to recognize the systemic things that are there, and it's all based on self-interest. and from self-interest comes racist and discriminatory policies, but that doesn't have to be that way.
Thank you. Thank you very much for sharing that perspective and for reminding us of our commitment that we do have to share resources and protect the environment and treat each other in a more equal way. So as you can see, there are a lot of important perspectives from various people in London and the surrounding area on how we can create these new systems that we are all really eager to put into place after this pandemic. And taking this time to design and create and discuss them is really important so that we can make sure that we get these new structures right. So next up, we have questions for local politicians from the various organizations in London who helped organize the event. And so I'll be introducing the politicians first, and then I'll be asking the organizations who submitted the questions to ask their questions directly. So first up, we have Peter Franciscados, who has served as the MP for London North Centre since 2015, combining his experience as a political scientist, media commentator, and active volunteer with a commitment to effectively representing Londoners at the federal level. He's currently a member of the Standing Committee on Finance and the Special Committee on Canada-China Relations. We're also joined by Peggy Sattler, MPP for London West since 2013, and is currently the Ontario NDP Deputy House Leader and the critic for democratic reform, employment standards, and pay equity. She has served as a trustee on the Thames Valley District School Board for 13 years, including 2 terms as board chair, and was the director of policy at the Academica Group, leading provincial and national research studies with a focus on post-secondary education. We're joined as well by Jessie Helmer, who represents Ward 4 in London and who has served as deputy mayor for the city since 2018. A strong advocate for improving transportation, mobility, and building a more compact, affordable, healthier, and fairer city. He is a commissioner of the London Transit Commission, member of the Planning and Environment Committee, and the past chair of the Civic Works and Corporate Services Committees. He's also served as a chair of the Middlesex London Health Unit and a member of the Old East Village BIA, as well on the London Police Services Board. And then also we have Grand Chief Joel Abram, who will be answering some of the questions as well. So the first question was submitted from Women in Politics. So I'll be asking Sarah, who is their chair, to ask the question, and that will be directed at Peggy and Jessie.
Hello, everyone. The question from Women in Politics is this. How can you ensure diverse voices and perspectives, specifically women, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, or economically disadvantaged populations, are meaningfully engaged in recovery efforts, especially considering the barriers they already face that might prevent them from providing input into solutions, for example, language barriers or access to internet. And I'll go to Peggy first.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah, for the question, and congratulations on your new role with Women in Politics. It's great to see you in that chair. I really appreciate the question, and I'm going to address it on a couple of different levels. The first thing that I think we need to do to ensure meaningful engagement of diverse populations in recovery efforts is we need to understand the impact of climate change, of COVID-19, of racism on these different groups. And certainly we have seen with COVID-19 the hugely disproportionate impact on lower income communities, on racialized communities, on people who are already disadvantaged, have been affected by COVID-19 in a much bigger way than more affluent communities. And having that understanding, collecting that data, we need that race-based data so that we can understand what the impact has been, helps develop better solutions. The same thing goes with women and COVID-19 in terms of the economy. We know that something like 2/3 of the jobs that were lost in the initial lockdown of the economy were jobs that were held by women, and they were largely low-wage, kind of precarious jobs in the hospitality industry or the retail industry. So strategies to address the recovery have to look at what women need to re-enter the workforce. Women need childcare, they need a return to full-time schooling, and so any strategies that are developed to promote that recovery have to look at the needs of the populations who've been affected. On climate change, we heard from Joel, we know that Indigenous communities have been harmed the most by global warming. Canada's north is warming at a rate of twice the rest of the country, and Canada as a whole, on average, is warming much faster than other countries. So you have to have that understanding in order to develop meaningful solutions. At a legislative level, I want to say we need to have processes in place that are going to enable public participation in the development of policies that are going to address these issues. We just saw yesterday in the Ontario legislature a bill passed called the COVID Recovery Act, Bill 197. It went straight from second reading to third reading with zero public input. This was a bill that was developed, designed, called a recovery bill, but there was no input whatsoever, no opportunity for the public to come and say what they actually needed to help recover. So we need to have legislative processes in place that are going to enable people to come and talk to the lawmakers, the people who are developing and implementing these solutions, tell them what they need and tell them how the laws that the lawmakers are developing will actually affect them on the ground. And then finally, I just want to talk about electoral reform. I think what we have seen in climate change in particular, addressing the crisis that is unfolding globally with global warming, requires immediate action, but sort of with a long-term perspective. And too often we see governments that are politically motivated taking short-term solutions that don't really consider the big picture because they're looking at a 4-year cycle of the next election. If we have electoral reform, we would not only get much more meaningful involvement of
Hey, Peggy, I'm just gonna have to get you to finish your sentence, sorry.
That's okay. And do I get to finish? But electoral reform would enable the representation as well as participation. Sorry about
Thank
that.
you. No worries. Sorry to interrupt, but we're gonna keep on going through the time process. But thank you, Jesse. Would you mind also then unmuting and putting your video on and answering the question?
Sure. First, I want to say I really appreciate Malvin and Genevieve and Grand Chief Abram. I thought that was really great and gave me lots to think about. I kind of set aside my own notes and I was making notes on what they were saying. Very interesting. I wanted to just talk about this question from a couple of different points. One is we have some wonderful women and people of color, 2 Black councillors on our city council now. And I think part of making sure that we are including those perspectives is listening very carefully to what they have to say, the people who are elected and are on the council now, and supporting them in their efforts to lead us through this situation. We have some really great people who are on the council. We have a Métis councillor, we have 2 Black councillors, we have 4 women, and they're really great at their jobs. And I think we need to be listening carefully to what they're saying and supporting them, especially white guys like myself. I think we have to support the people who we already are working with. Second thing is, I think we have to recognize that during the recovery and the initial shutdown during the pandemic, our initial reactions in many cases were not great. So we did things at the city, for example, like we shut down advisory committees. You can imagine that the city, would go down to minimal and essential services only. And what that meant was, partly because you couldn't meet in person the same way we used to, all the advisory committees of citizens who have lots of different opinions and perspectives and experiences, come from a pretty wide variety of backgrounds, those groups were not meeting anymore, and they were not providing input into the decision making. And at the start of the pandemic, I had a bit of an odd situation where I was the acting mayor when the World Health Organization declared this pandemic. So normally that doesn't mean a whole lot. I might have to sign some bylaws and go to some events and do some stuff like that. But all of a sudden we were into an emergency, and it was a bit more meaningful. and the decision making started to kind of tighten up. So I think we have to be careful that we don't do that we don't shut out voices because things are urgent, that we don't say, well, that's not essential, we'll just go ahead with what we've got. I think that's a very strong tendency, is to kind of slip into a habit, to not really be intentional about getting diverse opinions and perspectives. And we can make mistakes, not intentionally trying to exclude people, but just out of bad habits. And I think we saw that. We had a couple of task forces set up early on in the recovery and the initial impact. And I think there was lots of value that those groups provided. We were able to have dozens of meetings over a couple of months with many, many people in all different kinds of sectors in the economy. But when you look around at the Zoom meetings, it was a lot of white people and it was a lot of guys. And I don't think that is, that's not an intentional thing. We're not trying to go out there and make sure we hear just from all the white men. But what we had done was we picked the head of all these organizations. We're like, you and you and you and you, and look at that. It's a whole bunch of the same sort of looking people, same kind of age, same kind of income backgrounds. There's a lot of things in common there. And it was not entirely like that, but there was a lot of that. And I think now we're moving into something called the London Community Recovery Network, which is going to be a much more sustainable, I think, approach to recovery. And I think we have to be very intentional about making sure that we don't do that, that we don't replicate the same kind of thing that is causing problems in our recovery efforts specifically. So I think we have to think very—
I'm just going to have to let you finish your sentence, Jesse.
Yeah, who needs to be involved, and make sure that they can stick to 4-minute interventions.
Yeah, great. So I'm just going to remind some of the speakers, I think you're doing great at trying to keep in the 4-minute window because it's very short. But Leah also is putting her timekeeping sheets up in her video. So if you're able to pin her video, she'll give you a little warning. Next up, our question is from the Poverty Research Center at King's, and Mike Curry will be asking it to Peter Franciscados. So Mike, if you don't mind unmuting yourself.
Hello?
Hello.
Are we on board? Yes. Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you to the hosts for hosting, and also for the panelists for being here around this important topic. So really picking up around this question about not reproducing or redoing the mistakes that we've made in other arrangements. So in the discussion about bringing together this green and inclusive economies into these approaches, there's a call for the role of public ownership in certain industries and other business models that call for community ownership, such as cooperatives and nonprofit corporations. How will you commit to ensuring decent work and wealth equity under traditional private-public partnership arrangements? And what are the opportunities for community ownership in that? And how does that sort of, leverage this moment for the importance of greening the economy with also developing decent work opportunities and broader distribution of wealth? Thank you.
Thanks very much. Appreciate that, and great to be with everybody tonight. It's been a while since I saw any of you, the ones that I know up close, and the ones that I don't know, looking forward to getting to know you even better. This is great to be a part of, so thanks to the organizers, all of you, for putting it together. It's a great question, Mike. I appreciate it. There's many ways to look at it, I think, and I'm glad to take it on my own. I also think it's a question that needs to be raised within municipal circles and at the provincial level too. For me, you talk about community ownership and different ways that we can approach public policy. It's a big question, and instead of being general, I'd like to be even specific about it. There's this huge push towards social enterprise that we see in communities right across the country, and London is no different. Of course, we have Pillar, and everybody knows about the excellent work that they do by encouraging social enterprise organizations. That has, I think, started to help shape and redefine how we can understand the way forward when it comes to dealing with public policy problems. Government has a major role to play, but social enterprise is there as well, ready to address the major issues of the day, whether they're social problems, economic challenges, environmental issues. And so more of a partnership between government and social enterprise will be absolutely vital. The more we look at COVID-19, it presents a real opportunity, this crisis, to do things differently. And in that, if we can pivot in that direction, I think you're seeing the federal government move ahead. There was an announcement yesterday talking about the federal government being intent on working more with social enterprise organizations that want to address some of the primary social challenges that are facing us. We can talk about a more equitable way of carrying out public policy. So that's one thing I would put to you. The other thing is that we have an opportunity at the federal level, and this has started in some ways, but it's only in its infant stages. And that's basically how do we decide who we support? So when it comes to government contracts, for example, one of the things that's being implemented now is what's called GBA plus analysis, gender-based analysis, and the plus stands for intersectionality. And one of those intersections that we can look at and do look at is race, and looking at marginalized communities that have not benefited, if at all, from government support in the past in terms of the issuing of, I give a specific example here, government contracts for federal government work. So when it comes to supporting businesses that are Indigenous-led, for example, or Black-led, this is something that the federal government can take into account and support those organizations towards securing a more equitable outcome in terms of the decision-making that happens at the federal level. Last thing I'll say is to repeat what I said at the outset, which is it's important for the federal government to continue to move in this direction as it is, but we won't see meaningful outcomes unless we also see it at the municipal and provincial levels too, and I think we can do that.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Peter. You were perfectly timed. That was great.
Okay.
And I appreciate the answer and agree. If we had more time, I think we'd be asking all these questions to everyone because I think they're important for all levels of government to comment on. To keep everyone on their toes, we're going to do a poll now. So if people are still at their computers, we'll know. But if you're out getting a drink, then you'll miss the poll. But if we could queue up, I'm going to actually see if I can do it. There we go. If we can queue up the poll. So in front of you for attendees, unfortunately the co-host won't be able to vote, but we're wondering what your top 3 priorities are for a green and just recovery in London. So please scroll down. There are 10 items on the list. Can people access it? You can see. Oh, there we go. I can see some votes coming in. Excellent. So yeah, I'm going to give about 30 seconds for this. We just want to get a sense of where people are coming from in the discussion. Keep in mind there are a couple more options at the very bottom, so scroll down and choose your top 3. Very cool. Ooh, I feel like people are changing their mind as they're looking through them because they keep on moving. There we go. All right, I'm gonna give it another 10 seconds. See where people are coming in on. All right. Ooh, maybe we'll get to everyone. Look at this, 86% of people voted. If only 86% of people voted. No, I'm just kidding. You have the right to not vote if you don't want to. All right, I'm gonna stop it here because I feel like we're stalling at 63 out of 72. So it's looking like a pretty wide variety of people interested in. The top ones are investing in green industry and renewable energy, Indigenous solidarity and partnerships, and a couple ties for 21 at reducing urban sprawl and walking and cycling. Awesome. Okay, thank you guys for sharing that. We want to actually, the organizers are interested in doing a series of events, so it's good to know what people are really interested in learning more about and discussing. So moving on to the third question, it's coming from Matt Losa, and Emma Young will be asking it to Jesse and Joel. So Emma, if you wouldn't mind unmuting yourself and asking the question.
Sure. Yeah. So this is for Jesse and Chief Abram. What are your thoughts on reconciling with Indigenous people by dedicating natural green spaces throughout the city and particularly along the river for the exclusive use of Indigenous people?
And I'm going to say, Chief Abram, do you want to go first?
Sure, I can go first. I think that's a neat idea, although I think, it would be good for everyone to share, as well. I think maybe if there was, one of the things I thought that should be done in this area is to have like an inventory of, of just, whether it's animals or certain plants, and then have some protection to those areas. And for instance, I don't know if you know this, but from Springbank down to where I am, it was actually called the Spring Valley, and it has a very unique feature as a flat river bottom, formed by a glacier, thousands of years ago. And that's kind of a unique feature that we have. And what that does is it creates aeration, and helps to clean the water and that kind of stuff. And so there's a lot of, if you get to First Nation territory, a lot of the riverbank has been undisturbed and it's kind of been left how it is. And I kind of think there needs to be more of that to create the habitats for wildlife that use that. I know from dealing with the MNR, they know that when there's species, so there's certain types of species that can only be found on First Nation territory. For instance, there's a certain kind of turtle. There's only a few spots left in Ontario, and all those spots are in Indigenous territories because there's actually societies of people that are delegated to ensure that these turtles survive, because some of them are used for ceremonial purposes. And so now I was surprised to find out that there's only certain places where these turtles exist now, which is in First Nation territories. And that's because the riverbanks have been so modified, and that's part of their habitat of where they live at. So I think it's a good concept, but I think it really needs to be looked at a bit more. But I think there's a lot of other things that could be done as well along the river. And I think that's a great natural resource. But the number one thing we have to do is to actually make sure that the river is clean, reduce agricultural input, reduce raw sewage going into it, just stop doing bad things to that river, because that also affects Lake Erie, as with algae blooms and stuff like that. So I think the number one priority is cleaning up that river, and then taking a look at a long-term plan for it. What kind of species are there? What kind of plants are there that need to be looked after? And just try to have more of a holistic view of our nature. And a lot of those things have uses as well. So I think that's good. Green tourism, I think, is something that we should capitalize on a bit more, whether it's boat launches or those kind of things. Hopefully the Springbank Dam doesn't come back up as a topic, because I think the river's a lot more healthy the way it is now. But definitely, I think my greatest concern with the river is having water cleaner, a lot cleaner than it is going through it. And we know that London is the third worst polluters of rivers within the province right now. And that's mostly due to aging infrastructure, but hopefully that's something that can be fixed sooner rather than later.
Thank you. You're actually touching, no one knows this, but that is similar to an answer to the next question we have. So thank you for bringing that up for water cleanliness and algae blooms. So then Jesse, we'll turn it to you to answer the same question.
Thank you, and I appreciate hearing from Grand Chief Abram first on that issue. I appreciate the question from Atlosa. It's not something that Indigenous leaders have raised with me in the past, and I would certainly want to discuss it with them to see what they thought about it. There's a lot of priorities that Indigenous leaders have in London, in terms of the urban Indigenous population, as Grand Chief Abram has just mentioned, in terms of what's happening with the river and what's going on downstream. And I want to make sure that we don't presume what those priorities are, or, you know, say that sounds like a good idea and start moving on it without actually talking to the leadership, getting their input, taking the time to actually consult in a meaningful way about these kind of things. And if there is some interest in that, I'd certainly be interested in talking about it. I have my initial reaction is a little bit of hesitation around the exclusive use part, because I think a lot of folks want to get down to the river, connect in with the river, and could be a great opportunity for people to be learning from each other. And so I'd be interested in learning more about it. I know that some other communities that has been happening. You know, it's not like it would be the first of its kind. I think we've seen it happen elsewhere, even in Canada. So I'd be interested in learning more.
Thank you. Thanks for being open, Jesse. That's great. The next question is back to Emma, but it's coming from Chippewa of the Thames First Nation, the Trees, Land, and Environment Department, and it will be going towards Peggy and Jesse. So Emma, if you want to queue yourself up.
Sure. Hello again. So maybe Peggy can answer first and then Jesse. How will you more rapidly address the relatively frequent sewage overflow bypasses that are released into the Thames River that could potentially compromise 3 downstream First Nation communities' drinking water supply because it comes from an aquifer that's fed by the river?
Thank you, Emma, for the question. The first thing that I want to say is that access to clean, safe drinking water is a human right. So that's full stop. That's non-negotiable. We have to do whatever we can to ensure that all First Nations communities have access to clean water. We also need to work with our First Nations partners in a true government-to-government relationship. So that is also, that's sort of a foundational principle of the work that needs to be done. In terms of the aquifer and the river, my party, the Ontario NDP, has been calling for a provincial water strategy that would be based on the principle that decisions about water must be directed at ensuring that the public interest is protected, and that every Ontarian, including every First Nation, has access to reliable, safe drinking water. One of the challenges for the municipality right now in terms of infrastructure is the financial hardship that has been caused by COVID-19. So we know that, well, Jesse will know the numbers better than me, but I understand it's close to $14 million deficit that London is potentially looking at by the end of August because of COVID-19. And that will have a huge impact on the city's ability to undertake infrastructure projects. The province needs to be right at the table as a direct partner in funding these critical municipal infrastructure that is needed to maintain the health and safety both of Londoners and, as you point out with this example, of surrounding communities. So we will continue to urge the province to provide the funding that municipalities need, and also to have to take a big picture look at a provincial water strategy that addresses the right of every Ontarian to clean, safe drinking water. I hope I was in time.
Yeah, you did great. Thank you. And I loved hearing about that strategy. I'm going to look into it a little bit more. Okay, then let's turn it over to Jesse to answer this question.
So lots to say on this one. I'm going to go fast. Hopefully it's not incomprehensible. This is a really important question, and the city has a pretty extensive plan for how to solve this problem. It is over $200 million to solve the problem sort of within just the city's infrastructure. All those big holes you see dug up on York Street and in the downtown, a lot of those are sewer separation projects where we're taking very old infrastructure that was designed in a bad way and fixing it. And we're able to do those projects because the federal government and the provincial government have been putting money into infrastructure through the clean water, wastewater funding, and now through the ISIP, the Investing in Canada Infrastructure Program. The key thing to make that go faster is for the province to speed up the review of the green infrastructure funding, which is currently kind of waiting. So, you know, that would really help because the federal government has really made that a priority. They put it on the table. We've applied for the funding. It would be great to have that released and actually be able to flow into those projects, and then we can do them a bit faster. This is a multi-year thing, and it's not going to solve the whole problem. You heard from Grand Chief Abram earlier on that there's a lot of different sources of pollution into the river. Some of them are sewage overflows, and that's something that can be dealt with by changing the infrastructure, and that's what we're working on through the Pollution Prevention Control Plan. But there's a lot of agricultural sources that run off into the river, and those are harder to act on because there's a lot of them all up and down private property all along the watershed. And the solutions to those are harder because they involve private actors making changes to their practices. They're not really infrastructure fixes, they're policy fixes, they're private actor behavior changes. And that is the bigger source of the pollution. And it's a bigger opportunity to get the phosphorus, for example, reduced significantly. We are taking the dam out. You know, we're not going to fix that. We're going to make it inoperable so that we're not going to have the water impounding and creating more environmental problems. So that's a decision the city's already taken, but there's a lot in the works. The key to accelerating it is really to have the province allow the funding that's been put on the table from the federal government to flow through to the municipality so we can move those projects a bit quicker. And it's a good example of 3 levels of government all working together on a really important problem.
Great. Thank you very much for both of those answers, Peggy and Jesse. I am excited to see progress on that aspect as well. The next question is from Climate Action London, and Bob Morrison will be asking it to Peter, Grand Chief Abram, and Peggy. So Bob, if you want to.
Hi, thanks, Skylar. The COVID-19 pandemic has shown us that resiliency is enhanced by diversity. What would your government do to ensure that recovery stimulus funds are used to help diversify London, Ontario, and Canada's economies away from carbon-dependent industries and towards greater resiliency by supporting businesses and manufacturing that create local green jobs and support green economy of the future? Thank you.
So Peter, we'll ask you to go first,
Sure,
please.
I can take that first. No, great question. And I think, as I said before, this is a crisis, and I think it was Rahm Emanuel actually who coined it, who said that in every crisis comes an opportunity, and we would be foolish not to recognize the potential for diversifying our economy and making sure that a green focus is at the center of that. The federal government right now is talking about not just relying upon infrastructure as a way to stimulate the economy, but making sure that we support shovel-worthy projects, not just projects that are going to generate an economic boost, but an economic boost and have a green focus at the very core of that particular project. We have not moved in the direction of putting forward a call for proposals yet for municipalities, for example, for an infrastructure policy that would stimulate the economy, but I can assure you that is coming. And like I said, a green focus has to be at the very center of it. This includes, you know, cycling. It includes transit, electrifying transit. I know that Jesse's particularly passionate about that locally here, and I've said before, I think that we should move towards electrifying our fleet, first with a pilot project in London and then scaling up from there. We're known in this city as a manufacturing town, but while we have many great manufacturing firms, we ought to continue to encourage the green firms that exist, those that are carrying out manufacturing, but with a green focus in mind. And there's many ways to do that, including making decisions to support businesses that have that environmental focus at the foremost, or at the forefront rather, of their activities. Retrofitting, I saw it was on the list of questions in terms of priorities that you just polled on. I wasn't surprised to see that it was given a lot of support. 12% of the greenhouse gas emissions in Canada that we see come from emissions that are released from homes and from buildings. So supporting municipalities in terms of retrofitting their properties, supporting universities, schools, hospitals, the MUSH sector that we talk about, if you want to use that acronym. That's going to be very important. And I also think that is an issue of diversification in the economy, because when government leads in that area, it sends a signal to construction firms that there's a great deal of interest in this, and they pivot, if they haven't already, to carrying out that work. And let's face it, and this is the last point, Scott, this is where society is going. We are seeing an enormous shift in consumer patterns that are making the environment a key area of concern. And I really hope that with COVID-19, I hope we don't stop talking about the environment. I think there was so much momentum prior to the crisis, prior to the virus and its onset, that we would be foolish to stop looking at it as the issue of our time. Let's take it and make sure it's at the forefront of the economic recovery that's to take shape in the months and years ahead.
Thank you very much, Peter. That was a great answer. And I'm really excited to see some retrofit funding come to residential communities, and also maybe some commercial properties. Yeah. But that's Skylar's 2 cents.
On that in the last election, we talked about making sure that funding would be there to carry that out, and I fully expect that, especially as the recovery goes forward, that'll be there for sure.
Wonderful. I'm going to turn the same question over now to Grand Chief Abram, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
All right, thank you. I think there's a lot of things that we can do, as a society. I think, we have to, I'm thinking of even of solar panels, and energy. To create solar panels actually uses a lot of fossil fuels. And I think we have to put a lot of research and innovation monies aside to maybe kind of retool how these things are designed and manufactured. To use materials that don't rely as much on those products, because they might seem clean at first, but it actually takes a lot of dirty energy to create this clean products. So I think we need to do a lot of STEM things, in terms of encouraging our young folks to get into STEM, engineering, science, technical, engineering, mathematics, all that stuff. In order to have those innovative minds that are constantly working towards the future, and reinvest in our youth, so that they can, help to save. Because I think, they're the group that I think that make the most noise nowadays, because it's their future that we're talking about, and those faces yet to come. We have to think about those next 7 generations. Are we going to be living in an environment that's sustainable for them? We hear the grave warnings from climate scientists now that we're just at the tipping point. We really have to radically alter the way that we do things. And I think, maybe taking a look at, some of the traditional environmental knowledge that Indigenous people have to offer, and how can that fit into that big picture. I think there's a lot of things that we've done, in terms of ensuring that we're part of that circle of life and not above that. I think just in terms of how we do things. Also, looking at sustainable agricultural practices, getting rid of neonicotinoids. Those are still, front and foremost when it comes to a lot of farming. And of course, those are not good for bees, and I'm assuming other insects as well. Different ways of, possibly fertilizing fields, because we get a lot of the runoff. So you have to take a look at things like the Drainage Act. That influences where that drainage goes at the end of the day, and how that's dealt with. So there's a lot of different things that we have to talk about, when it comes to clean water. Ending, I saw a question a little earlier about about bottled water, ending that. And so, I think that's something that, as a association of AIAI, where I'm the Grand Chief from, we talk a lot about that. We don't know what the long-term impacts are of taking groundwater out, then it's never going to return to that same resource. A lot of it is exported and so we don't know what the long-term impacts of that are going to be. So since we rely on Great Lakes, we have such a great resource, we have to really take care of that. and rely upon that. And there's a lot of business that can be, you know, come from that as well. You know, there's, you know, you can get energy from waves. You can do a lot of innovative things. So I think there's just so many areas. You know, there's ecotourism. There's, you know, medicines, and there's, you know, fishing. There's all kinds of great ideas that we can have. But I think STEM and research and technology, for instance, landfills, are we going to come up with a technology to mine landfills, to empty those? You know, we don't know what the long-term effects of those are going to be. We are 2 kilometers away from Toronto's landfill.
Sorry, I'm just going to have to ask you to wrap up your last thought there.
Okay, so there's a lot of things that's already been done to damage the environment. Can we find technology to reverse that damage?
Great, thank you. Yes, I think innovation will be key for a lot of those things. So the final person answering this question is Peggy. Peggy, would you please be able to unmute yourself?
Thanks, Skylar. I want to go back to something that Malvin said at the very beginning about the links between climate justice, racial justice, and economic justice. And I think we're at this unprecedented moment where we have an opportunity to link those three priorities and really make transformative change, create the kind of economy that we want, that addresses both equity and sustainability. One thing that we have learned through COVID-19 is the importance of these essential jobs, the care jobs, healthcare, long-term care, childcare. These are low-carbon jobs, and we have traditionally devalued these kinds of jobs. We've devalued the people who work in those jobs. We have to ensure that those caring low-carbon jobs have the kind of security, benefits, living wages, those kinds of things that people need in order to thrive in those kinds of employment. The reality is that coming out of this COVID-19, there may be industries and businesses that won't come back. And so this does create that opportunity to really shift, to introduce new job opportunities, particularly related to retrofits. As Peter was mentioning earlier, there are studies that show that every $1 invested in energy conservation retrofits generates $4 in economic activity. So there could really be a huge increase in employment opportunities as well as economic advantages by massive infusion of investment into building retrofits, public transit investments, green infrastructure, those kinds of things. We also need to look at understanding the interdependence that we have as a society. It's, you know, when one of us is protected, we are all protected. And we're seeing that right now in the debate about masks. People are recognizing that it is an act of social solidarity to wear a mask, and we're all in it together. And I think that that's a good message to come out of this this recovery. So acknowledging the need of all of us to have meaningful employment is really important. We need to invest in education. There's going to be a lot of workers who will be displaced by the transition to a green economy, and we need to make sure that there are opportunities for those workers to move into the new opportunities that are created. And particularly, we have to focus on marginalized communities, people who have not benefited from the old economy, to make sure that there are ways that they can have those entry points into getting those good green jobs of the future.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Peggy. All right, we just have 2 more questions, and then we're going to be pulling a couple from the chat box. So Mike's already kind of combed through and found some themes. But the next question is from the Middlesex London Food Policy Council, and it's going to be asked by Benjamin Hill to Peter and then to Peggy. So Ben, would you mind unmuting yourself and asking the question?
Yes, thank you. Thanks everyone for participating in this event. It's been really great so far. I really have been enjoying listening to all the answers to the questions. My question concerns food insecurity. COVID-19 has brought food insecurity into clear focus for all of us and highlighted the need to build community resiliency by building local capacity for food production and food supply chain management. How would you provide policy and program supports to initiatives that would expand resiliency and capacity, such as a regional food hub in London and targets for community consumption of locally produced foods? Thank you. Peter, why don't you start, please?
Happy to. Thanks for that, Benjamin. Obviously, London is an urban center, but we're surrounded by some of the best farmland in the entire country. So continuing to encourage as much as we can agricultural growth and well-being in the surrounding communities of London would be, I think, a really important thing to get behind and to champion. Beyond that, though, there are initiatives that obviously are taking place in our city that deserve real attention and deserve support. At the outset, Melvin talked about creating that our fundamental goal, or at least one of them, should be creating more just and equitable cities. I don't think you have a just or equitable city unless food security is really one of the foremost things that you look at and prioritize. I know the federal government has moved ahead with something called the Local Food Infrastructure Fund, which does support initiatives in urban centers. Anything from helping a food bank, for example, with a fridge or the costs relating to a fridge, to more significant costs that allow for food to get out into the community. I was just thinking about it earlier today, even something around the costs of greenhouse in London could, under the eligibility of the program, something like this, let's say if there was a group of local organizations that came together, as I know is there's conversations and action on this in London to support food growth, but through a greenhouse model. Federal government would be there to look at proposals like that. So, you know, it's things like this, and encouraging urban-based farming, encouraging organizations that are making that a priority through funding, I think is something that can always be looked at. So that's how I would answer the question. And actually, Skylar, what I can do is tomorrow I can follow up with you and send information on this Local Food Infrastructure Fund. I imagine folks already have it actually, but I know there is calls for proposals that's open right now. The government is accepting proposals to come in, and I think it's an encouraging thing. So.
Thank you. Yes, I actually just got a link for it today, so that was a good reminder. I'll host it in the chat box. So thank you for reminding me. That looks like an exciting opportunity. Peggy, would you be able to answer the same question, please?
Sure. First, I want to say congratulations to the Middlesex London Food Policy Council. I think it's really exciting to see the work that's being done on a community-wide basis by that organization. And certainly, we have seen in London what happens when sort of, you know, organizations that are concerned about food security are able to collaborate, and when entrepreneurs are taking on projects like what we're seeing in the Old East Village, and that kind of economic revitalization that comes with a focus on increasing access to secure food sources. I think that from the provincial perspective, one of the things we also saw related to COVID-19 and food insecurity is really the vulnerability of our food supply. When we look at the rates of COVID infection among migrant workers, and a lot of people, hadn't really thought about the living conditions and working conditions of migrant workers until we heard about the very high rates of infection. We also saw that with our meat processing facilities. So many of the workers in meat processing plants were also infected by COVID-19. So I want to go back to my earlier response. We have to make sure that there are decent working conditions for the people who work to ensure that we have a safe and secure food supply. I think at the provincial level, one of the things that we have always pushed the government to do is to buy local and provide as many incentives as possible for government organizations, for Ontarians to promote local food products, and that is something that we will continue to do. We are also pushing for the expansion of the Greenbelt and for environmental regulations that actually protect and preserve rural farmland. We have seen from the Ontario government regulation after regulation being cut that opens up farmland to development, and that is doing nothing to help protect our local food supply. Another sort of approach that I'm very interested in is looking at local food as an economic development strategy. And so I think that the provincial government should look seriously at a local food cluster strategy, maybe using London as an example, and how we can use local food programs and initiatives to really generate local economic development.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing, Peggy. All right, so the final question that we have from organizations is from the Urban League of London. And it'll be asked by Shauna and directed to Jesse. And then we're going to do some rapid fire chat box questions. So stay on your toes.
Okay, thank you. So thank you to our political guests and panelists for your answers. And I just want to say thanks to the attendees for your comments and the questions that you're adding to the chat box, because they're adding a lot to the town hall. So our question is, COVID-19 has further highlighted the importance of local communities, supports, and economies. What do you see as the role of neighborhoods in a just and green recovery for everyone? And I think the question's to Jesse.
Yeah, thanks very much for the question. I think what we've seen so far in the response to the pandemic is many wonderful examples of people coming together to help each other out and to help their neighbors get through very difficult circumstances. But I do think it's important to recognize that the pandemic impacts different kinds of neighborhoods in different ways. And I think what we're realizing as we're starting to analyze some of the immediate impacts from a public health perspective is, areas where you have a lot of unsuitable housing. So you've got people crowded into not very much space. Areas where you have the congregate living, for example, in the situation of a migrant farm workers who may be living in a bunkhouse and they're very close together. That the nature of the housing and how people are living together in community is a pretty significant factor in terms of what's going on with the pandemic. And you can see why that would be the case. And, different neighborhoods have different kinds of resources to bring to bear to help each other out. So it's one thing to help each other out in an upper middle class neighborhood where everyone's got 2 cars and lots of money and, they can go do grocery shopping and stuff like that. It's another thing to, be looking after your parents who are living with you because you're in a multi-generational housing situation. You're trying to look after your kids, you're going to work because you're an essential worker, and then your neighbor across the street hasn't cut their grass in a while. And, you know, going across the road and cutting the grass for your neighbor, you know, that is a really helpful thing that can be done, but it doesn't happen in every neighborhood because a lot of people don't have time to be doing those kind of things. They're too busy with other things in their life. And so I don't think we should expect, you know, all neighborhoods to be the same or all people to help each other out in the same kind of way. So that's my first comment, I would say. I think it's really essential that we listen to what people are saying in their neighborhoods about what the issues are, what kind of supports are needed, and that we recognize they're going to be able to help each other out to some extent, but they're also going to require government to step in and do things at different levels to support and solve some of those problems, because it's not as though everything can be solved by neighbors helping each other. Not all neighbors and neighborhoods have the same resources. If we just left every neighborhood to kind of fend for itself, I don't think that would be a just approach, right? We have to approach it from an equity perspective, think about what people need, listen carefully to what those needs are. And I think neighbors and local organizations like neighborhood associations very good at identifying what the issues in their area are, very good at coming up with solutions, but they're not going to be able to solve all of these problems themselves. And so I think governments, you know, we need to listen to what they're saying, help them when they need help, act when it's the government that needs to act, and in some cases get out of the way when they can solve problems themselves.
Great. Thank you, Jesse, very much. All right, so we're moving into what I am calling the lightning round, which I just made up. So we're going to be pulling questions from the chat box, and I'm going to be asking our speakers to answer them, but you get 2 minutes. You get half the time. But luckily, the first question is pretty straightforward. So from the chat box, we pulled, what has your level of government identified as the single most important thing it can do or stop doing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? And how will your plans be impacted by the pandemic? So single most important thing you can do or stop doing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and how will they be impacted by the pandemic? So I'm going to start with Grand Chief Abram.
Okay. Single most important thing that we can do to reduce greenhouse gases, I think is, you know, looking at our energy production. You know, I know that there's coal-fired plants were shut down a while ago, but I think, you know, that's, you know, everyone uses, and in heating, I think is the other one, and uses of fossil fuels, I think is probably the biggest thing, because we all know the byproducts from those. So I think if we can reduce our usage of fossil fuels, I think that that's just a win-win for everyone, and find alternative means of energy production. And I think that'll mean a real turnaround once we can do that. So I think that's number one, because that's the biggest contributor to, you know, global warming and climate change, I think. Yeah, I think for me, that's number one. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Off to a great start on the lightning round. All right, I'm going to toss this over to Peter, and then Peggy, and then Jesse. So Peter, 2 minutes.
Most significant thing that has been done is putting a price on carbon, no question, and that must continue. You ask, Skylar, how has COVID-19 impacted that policy decision? Certainly there are calls from certain sectors, obviously the oil sector being at the top of the list, for that policy to be reversed. It must not be reversed. We have made so much progress in terms of right around the world. When a price on carbon is the policy, then it gives us the best chance to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That does not mean, though, that we can't support parts of the Canadian economy that could be negatively impacted by such a policy change. So again, I point to the oil sector. We've found a way to go ahead and help allocate money to oil firms that are now going to be carrying out cleanup of abandoned wells in Saskatchewan and in Alberta. So this is a way forward that I think works. It's a compromise, and one that keeps the environment at the center of what we're trying to do.
Great, thank you very much, Peter. Peggy, over to you.
Thanks, Skylar. I would agree with Peter that at the provincial level, that would have been the single most important thing that the Ford government could have done. They disbanded cap and trade. They refused to bring in a carbon pricing system. Thank goodness for the federal carbon backstop, which the Ford government is still challenging in court. But the other thing at the provincial level, from my party's perspective, as I mentioned before, is the building retrofits. That is an important initiative because it creates jobs and it reduces emissions. And so it is the kind of project that people can see a tangible benefit from. And I think that, for example, with the wind turbines and the solar farms, when they were brought in under the former Green Energy Act, and those sources of green energy production were owned by private sector multinationals. There was people didn't see a benefit from moving to renewable energy at the community level. So retrofitting is really, really important. And that is one of the reasons why it's kind of the centerpiece of the NDP's plan, the Green New Democratic Deal, is to embark on the most ambitious retrofitting program ever undertaken in Canada. We want to see at least 5% of all public buildings retrofitted by 2030. And that's part of our plan to get a 50% reduction in emissions by 2030 and get to net zero by 2050.
All right. Thank you very much, Peggy. And then Jesse, your 2 minutes are over to you.
The single most important thing at the local level would be actually realizing the vision of the more compact mixed-use city in the London plan, with rapid transit as the spine. I think we have to grow in a much more sustainable way than we have over the past few decades. The kind of sprawl pattern that we have seen is consuming prime agricultural land. It's resulting in land use patterns in the built form that support carbon intensive transportation. We can't keep doing that. We have to stop it. And that is the kind of action at the local level that I think will have the biggest impact. I will say applying the climate lens to major infrastructure projects is probably the most important new thing that we could do. We passed that not that long ago in response to the climate emergency declaration, which was brought forward as a request from the community. And that climate action lens, applying it to the major infrastructure projects, make sure we're assessing them as the federal government would like us to, frankly, to look at the GHG emissions. What will be the impact if you do this? I think that is the kind of decision-making change that needs to happen so that all infrastructure programs are being looked at through that lens. We'll make different decisions if we're applying that lens, and there'll be decisions that would be greenhouse gas reducing.
Great, that's getting a lot of good chat box of accolades. So thank you very much, Jesse. We are going to have to end it there, but like I said, all the questions in the chat box are being collected, and the organizing team is hoping to continue hosting these kinds of discussions or town halls. We are very interested also in hosting ones where we're able to do some collaborative action together. So please stay tuned. We want to keep people engaged. We also want to be doing things because we think action is really important. So Leah's just pulling up our final slides. But thank you very much to all of the organizers of the event. There are many people who sat on the organizing committee and also the organizations that spent their time on this as well. Thank you very much to the speakers we had at the beginning and the politicians that made time tonight to have these discussions and answer your questions. I'm sure everyone would be really interested in hearing more from you guys. So if you have thoughts about the recovery process and you'd like to send them, our organizations are listed there, and you can find your elected officials' organizational information online. So please stay tuned. We'll likely be sending some follow-up emails to let you know what the next couple events look like. But we appreciate everyone spending their time tonight coming to listen and to share. So with that, we end 2 minutes early. So everyone's favorite is if you end a little bit early. Oh, and a question in the box did say, will a recording be made of this meeting? Yes, we have been recording and we'll be sharing that as well, likely via email, and I'm sure a couple of our organizations will put them up on our website. So thank you again for coming. Thank you to all of the presenters and all of the politicians for coming. And I hope you guys all have a great night. Stay tuned for more. Oh, and I have one more request to remind, there's another conversation in August. Mohammed, do you mind reminding me of the name of it? Recovery 2020. I think if you Google it, there's another conversation happening that's similar, which we can share. We'll share it in the email. So August 13th. Stay tuned.